What is most important to you in life?
Not being stupid.
Really fascinating one, because you talk in the book about the fact that now women are a majority on 2/3 of college courses in the US. And, you know, I've also seen you saying, well, you believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. Maybe women...
It isn't only that I don't believe in equality of outcome. I think it's an unbelievably pathological wish and doctrine.
Right,
and it's very dangerous. History has demonstrated exactly how dangerous it is. Equality of opportunity is something that anyone with any sense would support. But equality of outcome, it's...
So what's your problem with there not being...
beyond belief to support equality of outcome.
Okay, so what's your problem with there not being enough men in the social sciences? Perhaps women are just cleverer. Perhaps that's why there are more women at university, right? Under your doctrine. I don't think that, but that's
I think
the logical extension of your doctrine.
It isn't the fact that there's an unequal distribution. The problem I have with it is that the reason that men are bailing out is because of the prevalence of the doctrine that you're espousing. That's the problem I have with it. It doesn't matter that much. They will bail out. I don't see any way that the universities are going to redeem themselves in the next decade. So, and maybe that will be fine. But I doubt it. We'll see.
That seems extremely pessimistic when the numbers of people going to university just generally are going up.
Yeah, well, that's not going to last for very long.
Why not?
Because it's too expensive, and the universities are doing all sorts of things that aren't acceptable. Mostly racking up the price, ratcheting up the price. So, and decreasing the quality of what they're offering, and playing into the hands of the people who are ideological acolytes of the identity politics routines, and playing postmodern stunts, and pushing neo-Marxism, and all these things that are characteristic of the social sciences and the humanities primarily.
See, this is where I find you fascinating to me, because, you know, you talk in these quite apocalyptic terms. I think that, you know, someone will listen to that and think, wow, there's a really big problem. But what we're really talking about is some irritatingly postmodern professors and some students with blue hair and funny ideas about gender in a handful of courses around America and Western Europe. If that's what we were talking
about, no one would have paid attention to me for more than about 15 minutes. So you might see this as some surface manifestation that's irrelevant, but that isn't how most people view it. It's certainly the case, too, that this identity politics battle of ideas was a determining factor in the last American election. If Hillary wouldn't have played identity politics, played cozy with the identity politics types, she would have kept the working class and she would be president now. So these aren't trivial issues by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just some kids having a decent time while they're being creatively rebellious at university. It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to are predicated on, well, one assumption they're predicated on, it's probably the primary assumption, is that the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous, and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created. You know, I was reading about some Indonesians...
Do you mean me as a woman or me as a 21st century person in the world?
I mean us, yeah.
I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the project of politics is...
construction of a tyrannical patriarchy. You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
A progressive
That's a
means.
perfectly reasonable proposition.
But I guess
that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of a tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good, and yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family. Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Oh, well, fair enough. But if
you could trade it off with someone who's less privileged.
I could.
That'd be a start.
I could do that, but I don't want to, and I won't, and I don't think I should be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay for you to occupy a position of privilege in the patriarchal tyranny? And if it is it because you're female, or is it just because it's convenient?
Well, let me tell you my political philosophy. I'm I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, you know, New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich.
But what I do, filthy rich?
Well, I think I would leave that
You're probably in the top 1/10 of 1% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not
sure
that I'm going
the line exactly?
Be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forwards, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life.
Western civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
But it's not purely a tyrannical patriarchy,
That's for sure.
Is it?
It's purely not.
Right.
And that's exactly the issue.
But why
because
would you
when
deal with moral
describe it as a
absolutes
tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that. And that's exactly what's ungrateful.
Why
it's not purely that at all.
Why is saying that something has elements of this maybe the same as it is purely that?
That isn't what's being said. Merely to define it as a patriarchy implies unidimensionality. And to insist that that's also tyrannical doesn't offer a balanced viewpoint at all.
Well, I think that's probably where, I think that's probably where your disagreement comes with this, which is because I do not see it in that way. I do not see that as univariate at all. I see it as one element.
Then why call it a patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it?
Yeah.
What if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still a patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated offices, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatized, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. You know, they kind of reel back. We all make those implicit associations.
So if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way of, they should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too. Yeah, feeling left out too.
So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women, then it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy. We're kind of out of options.
Right, but, well, or you can have an office in which a blend of people of both sexes
So if it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
I'm saying that there is clearly, when it is only 15% of male primary school teachers, they do feel marginalised and excluded. So
you think the defining hallmark of a tyrannical social structure is the predominance of one gender, and if that was relatively equalised, then all of a sudden it would be a free and open institution.
I don't think that male primary school teachers are being tyrannised. I do think they are being marginalised, and I do think that they feel excluded and stressed.
So what do you do about that?
Well, this is what I mean. I think actually, and I'm surprised you don't agree with me on this, that actually having more male primary school teachers would be a really good thing, because boys need role models, actually. People, particularly boys who don't have a father figure in their life, that's really important for them to have a stable adult who shows them what it's like to be a man around the place.
Could be, but you shouldn't achieve it as a consequence of preferential hiring. Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. Like, that's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world, and the world is full of war. So how can that possibly work? If you're going to bring people together and they're going to exist together in harmony, they have to be playing a game that everyone plays, that everyone knows the rules for. It can't be 10 different sets of rules for different people. That isn't going to work. So it's absolutely naive to believe. How, if that worked, the world wouldn't be full of war.
Well, before we had, multiculturalism, we still did have war. In fact, war is, as Steven Pinker, I'm sure you read what Steven Pinker says, this is the least violent time in human history. So something
that's a consequence of the patriarchal tyranny.
Well, if you think that the patriarchy's been eroded over the last 100 years, maybe that's what it's down to. Maybe you could give some credit to it for that.
I actually didn't say that the patriarchy had been eroded.
Well, because you don't believe it existed in the first place. Fair enough. But my definition of multiculturalism is citizenship-based, right? So you can be both Canadian and First Nations. You can be both Quebecois and also Canadian.
But that means that everybody in the multicultural milieu is one thing and another.
Right.
But they're all one thing. And another.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, our Prime Minister said, well, there is no Canadian identity. It's like, well, okay, what is it that unites us? Well, nothing. We all protect our cultures. It's like, well, that leads to war.
Okay,
now, it doesn't only lead to war, obviously, but unless you have people operating within a shared framework of perception and value, they can't cooperate and compete peacefully. I don't understand how that's even a disputable topic. That's how you organize people.
Okay, I think if that's what he said, that's what Trudeau said, that is a dumb thing for the Prime Minister of Canada to say when you are Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, you might say that.
Would agree much more with what Barack Obama said when he said, you know, I'm trying not to make a red states America or blue states America or white America, black America. I'm trying to make a United States America. That to me is...
Yes, the Democrats are very good at that.
Well, they
played identity politics for the last 20 years. All they've done is inflame tribal tendencies, as far as I can tell. So he can say that, but it isn't obvious that it's the case. And it's not obvious to me at all that one of the consequences of Barack Obama's presidency was a reduction in racial tension in the United States.
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. I think a lot of people found having a black college-educated professor very alarming and threatening to their idea of themselves as the dominant group.
To stop them from voting for him twice.
No, that is very true, but again...
It's fundamentally true, right? It's really the crucial issue at hand here.
No, but he built a big coalition of white, well-educated liberals and people of colour. I mean, that is the Democrat electoral...
Well, how do you explain the rise of racial tension in the United States, then?
Well, I think it's caused by a lot of things, not least of one of which is the Republican Party inflaming it. You talk about the left playing identity politics. I think the right play identity politics all the time.
The right doesn't dominate the universities.
No, but it dominates... But Donald Trump is president, so realistically...
Donald Trump is hardly a typical Republican.
No, I would say that he accomplished...
In fact, for most of his life, if I remember correctly, he was a Democrat.
Right, I don't think he has any political...
So we're not going to blame Donald Trump on the right wing.
Okay, but I'm going to say the rest of the Republican Party are also quite happy to play, I would say, white identity politics. They did not dump him as their candidate when he said, Mexicans, they're not sending us their best people here, they're rapists, right? The whole idea of the United States, it said, I think a beautiful thing, all men are created equal, but it meant men, and it meant specifically white men. Women and black people could not vote. The US was founded on identity politics. This is not some new concept that has come along in the last 20 years.
The United States wasn't founded on identity politics.
Yes, it was.
That's absolutely absurd proposition. The United States was founded on the same principles that, what would you say, that played their powerful role through the development of English democracy. And that was nested inside a Judeo-Christian view that fundamentally presumed that both men and women were made in the image of God and that all people had divine value. And it took a long time for that set of ideas to fully manifest itself in the political realm. But to consider that a manifestation of identity politics is, I can't imagine why you would possibly do that.
I don't consider that a manifestation of identity politics. I consider having a constitution that says only some people are citizens to be a manifestation of identity politics.
Well, what do you think changed it across time? And look, let's get our definitions straight here. You can't lump all occurrences of non-equal treatment into the category of identity politics. Identity politics is a very specific thing. It's really only existed since the 1970s. You can't go back into 1770 and say that the founders of the American Constitution were playing identity politics.
They were playing politics that was based on identity. That's my definition of identity politics.
That's not the definition of identity politics unless you play fast and loose with the definition. Identity politics is something that's... No one talked about identity politics 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's a new term. You can't say that people's proclivity to identify with their group is identity politics. That's just tribalism. And that's like, who knows how old that is? 1,000,000 years old. 500,000 years old. And you're going to call tribalism identity politics? Well, that's not helpful. If you want to talk about tribalism, we could talk about tribalism. But identity politics is something that's nested inside a particular political view of the world. It's got a Marxist basis, and it manifests itself in postmodernism. And it emerged in the American France first in the 1970s, and then has swept through the American universities and increasingly the rest of the West since then. That's identity politics. If you want to talk about tribalism, that's fine. I'm not a fan of tribalism, which is why I don't like the identity politics types. And I don't care if they're on the right or the left. I think the right-wing use of identity as the primary marker for human categorization is as reprehensible and dangerous as it is on the left. My problem with the left at the moment, the fundamental problem with the radical left, is that they're hyper-dominant in academia. And that's not good. And that's not my opinion. You can go look at Jonathan Haidt's data and see for yourself. And he's as moderate a person as you could hope to find, and probably less prone to anger than me.
And I agree with you. I find a lot of students phenomenally irritating, but I would question how much power they have in contrast to the things that I find more worrying that are happening in the world today, right? Or even the professors, right? Even the professors.
20-year-olds don't have that much power, but they're not 20 forever. 10 years later, they're 30. And 20 years later, they're 40.
Right.
And whatever happens in the university happens everywhere 5 years later.
And very, very sadly for people in my politics, left-wing politics, what happens to people as they get older is that they've traditionally got more conservative. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can make a case that the current, where people are where they're 20 today is actually going to be the ideology that takes them all the way through their life. That's never been the case so far. No, but
it'll be around long enough to do plenty of damage, like it already is.
Okay, but even if we accept that students and their POMO professors are quite annoying, which I think is probably something I agree with.
They're not just annoying. Like, they're destroying the universities, and that's not a good thing. And they're particularly destroying the social sciences and the humanities. The sciences are safe so far, but not for long, because the scientists in particular are terrible at politics, and the left-wing activists are great at politics. And so they'll win eventually. The National Science Foundation is already introducing diversity requirements for hiring in mathematics in universities. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to work. There are hardly any mathematical geniuses. If you start putting all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on their hiring, you're just going to end up not finding the ones that there are. So, besides,
I don't think that's true, actually, because if you say there are very few mathematical
geniuses. What do you know about it?
Well, next year I'm going to be a fellow at Oxford University, so I spend time talking to academics. I've talked to a lot of academics for my book. I do agree with you, there is an illiberal strain that is sweeping through a lot of universities. I don't think it's an existential threat, and I certainly don't think it is, to me, the biggest issue in world politics today. It's the one that I would choose personally.
What do you think is the biggest issue?
I think that the rise of strongmen, authoritarians around the world is very worrying, and that's one of the reasons that I find the subtitle of your book fascinating, because it's called An Antidote to Chaos. Mm-hmm. Why isn't it an antidote to order, which you also say in its excessive manifestations is bad?
I've said that. Well, you can't write a book about everything.
No, but you've specifically chosen Antidote to Chaos. So why is chaos the big...
I have 300 lectures online, and I talk plenty about the pathology of order in those lectures.
Okay, but I'm just saying...
I'm no fan of authoritarian strongmen, that's for sure.
Well, that's good, but I do think that the way that you talk about order in the book is something that people will take away from it.
Be specific.
Okay, so let me think. The way that you talk about natural dominance hierarchies in lobsters. Let's get on to the lobsters. Because I think that the thing that people take away from that is male lobsters compete for female lobsters, and that says something about society now, that men need to be dominant in society. Because if lobsters do it, then there is something that we can read about humans from that too.
There's nothing in that chapter at all that suggests that the way that men should succeed in human hierarchies is a consequence of the exercise of power. There's not one line in that entire book that claims that, because it's not what I believe. Most human hierarchies, as I already pointed out, are hierarchies of competence, not power.
Okay, so
that's why we don't live in a patriarchal tyranny. And so if you want to be a successful man, then you should be competent. And that will move you up the hierarchy. And that will make you attractive, and for good reason, unless you want an incompetent mate, which is possible and happens, but isn't something that I would recommend. People will sometimes choose an incompetent mate because they're intimidated by competence. And so they'll settle for someone who they don't respect because they feel that they can master them and they won't be intimidated. But it's not a recipe for a happy life, I can tell you that. So there isn't a line in that chapter that talks about power as the proper means of conducting yourself in life. There's not a line in the book, and there's nothing in anything I've ever said that suggests that.
Okay, no,
but it's really important, because people have read this chapter, and they make exactly the argument that you make. And it's a misapprehension. So it's a misapprehension of the book.
Okay, but if so many people are getting the same misapprehension, could it be possible...
There aren't so many people that are getting it. There's 2 million people that have bought the book, and there's a very small handful of people who have a particular ideological perspective who enjoy developing that perspective because it indicates just what sort of reprehensible individual I am. But it has absolutely nothing to do with what I wrote or what I've said or what I believe. I don't believe that our fundamental hierarchies are based on power. I don't believe that the way that you move up our hierarchies is as a consequence of manifesting power. It's competence.
Okay. My big problem with the lobsters is that it's scientifically bollocks. right? It's just you cannot read across from lobsters and what they do to what humans do.
Of course you can. That's why serotonin works on lobsters.
But it works in two different ways. So serotonin makes lobsters more aggressive. It makes humans less aggressive. Right? That's what happens.
No, that's not right. Serotonin makes human beings more dominant but less aggressive. And the only reason it makes them more dominant is because they're less irritable and they're less defensively aggressive. So it's not bollocks. I know my neurochemistry. So if you're going to play neurochemistry, let's go and do it.
Okay, well, you say antidepressants work on lobsters.
Yes, they do. They make a lobster that's been defeated in a fight more likely to fight again.
That's not the same mechanism that happens in humans.
Yes,
because lobsters don't get depressed as the way that humans are. I think you're anthropomorphizing into a ridiculous degree. These are creatures that urinate out of their faces.
I think that the fundamental issue among knowledgeable animal behaviorists is that anthropomorphization with animals is generally the appropriate tactic unless you have reason to doubt it, which is because there's continuity between us and animals rather than discontinuity. And the idea that the anthropomorphization of animals is inappropriate is something derived from 1950s behaviorism. The highly trained affective neuroscientists and people who study motivation and emotion as well as neurochemistry know perfectly well that there is biological and behavioral continuity across the animal kingdom and way down into the kingdom as well, which is exactly why I chose lobsters, to indicate that there is so much continuity in the systems that allow us to estimate status position that we share it with creatures that are a third of a billion years old. And the reason that I made that argument was to put paid at least in part to the absurd Marxist proposition that hierarchical structures are a secondary consequence of Western civilization and free market economies, which is as preposterous a perspective as you could possibly develop about anything. Hierarchies are a third of a billion years old. You can't blame them on the West or men or capitalism. And we're wired for hierarchical perception in ways that you can hardly possibly imagine. Even our ability to rank order a set of objects seems to be tightly linked to our ability to assess the relative status of people in our social milieus. So, and the biochemistry is very, very similar. And the reason we know that is because most of the drugs that are used on people are first tested on animals. Now, it's not often animals as primitive as lobsters, but it is plenty. So a lot of what we know about neurological structure, for example, is a consequence of studying the flatworm, which is a much more primitive organism than the lobster. Continuity is the rule.
Okay, so what can we learn from killer whales that live in matriarchal pods, often led by a grandmother, someone who's been through a menopause? Why isn't that an example that you've picked to talk about in the book? It's because lobsters say the thing that ideologically you want to talk about, which is your belief that there is a kind of Marxist ideology sweeping.
How do lobsters say that? The point that I was making with lobsters, I just said what it was. That hierarchies have been around for a very long time.
But who genuinely, really, today is arguing, apart from maybe 3 mad Marxist academics, that there is no such thing as hierarchy? Hierarchies
They're not arguing that there's no such thing as hierarchy.
Oh, there should be no such thing as hierarchies.
Oh, there plenty of them are arguing that.
Really? Because I see that almost never in the wild as an argument. I see people think that hierarchy should be based on merit and they should be more equal.
What do you think the demand for equality of outcome is if it's not an attempt to flatten hierarchies or to eliminate them? What else could it possibly be? And you don't think the neo-Marxists and the postmodernists think that hierarchy is a social construction? Like, you're not talking about the same people that I know, right. That's for sure. Everything's a social construction for the social constructionists, including hierarchies.
But I just don't think that is a very widely held view in the world. It might be among liberal arts universities.
20% of social scientists identify as Marxist.
Where's that statistic from?
Look it up in Haidt's work.
Okay. I'm interested.
I've checked it out quite carefully.
Yeah, but
it's a perfectly valid statistic. I don't have the reference at hand.
Yeah.
So it's 1 in 5. Okay, and the number of conservatives, or even liberals for that matter, in the social sciences and humanities is not only vanishingly small, but getting smaller. And you think the social constructionists believe that hierarchy is built into biology? They're not very good social constructionists if that's what they believe. And the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists are radical social constructionists because they wouldn't believe that human beings are infinitely malleable and that we can be recreated in whatever image the ideologues might want to recreate us in if they didn't think that. And it's much more prevalent than you're admitting. I mean, there isn't a competing position on campuses except among the evolutionary biologists and the evolutionary psychologists, let's say, and they're under complete attack. They're certainly next on the chopping block, as far as I can tell. I've been warning them for the last 2 years. Social constructionists don't like evolutionary psychologists, and they don't like biology. And I really don't understand why, except that it interferes with this idea that human beings are infinitely malleable and stops them from being able to blame hierarchy on the West. Look, if you're really concerned about the poor, as a social democrat, let's say, the first thing you should do is abandon your presupposition that the dispossession produced by hierarchies is a consequence of the patriarchal structure of the West. It's a way deeper problem than that. So there have been people who've been dispossessed forever, way before capitalism.
Okay, I think I would agree with that. So if it is a way deeper problem than that, how do you tackle it?
I don't know.
Well, that's a bit... I mean, that, for someone as intelligent as you that just throw their hands up and go, ooh, maybe some people
There's lots of things I don't know how to tackle. I don't know how to tackle the fact that people range extremely widely in their cognitive ability either. These are big problems.
Right, but we could start with a redistributive tax policy, right, where people who earn a lot pay more tax than people lower down the income scale to redistribute income. That was a fairly obvious way that you could make poor people less poor. It's something that, you know, the Labour government did. They almost... I think they halved child poverty. It is possible to do things, and we do have mechanisms.
Well, I wouldn't make the immediate presumption that it was the redistributive tax policy that halved child poverty. You know that absolute poverty in the world has halved between the year 2000 and 2012, and you can't attribute that to redistributive policies.
No, I can't. I'm only talking about Britain. I'm talking about that particular government, which had, you know, then there are fiscal analyses that have been done. But I think let's move on from lobsters. I mean, you know,
that chapter is about people becoming responsible and competent, not about them becoming like dominant and powerful.
Okay,
it's not that at all.
But my problem with it is, I think you got criticised by a lot of marine biologists, right, and by a lot of geneticists.
I think
for
one.
It. Okay, well, I can name you. P.Z. Myers is one who's criticised you. Adam Rutherford, who's former editor of Nature, has criticised that chapter. There are, you know, that is not... But what I think is fascinating is that...
No reasonable biologists dispute the fact that most organisms organize themselves into hierarchies, and that the fundamental biological mechanism for the regulation of hierarchy is the serotonin system. That's not disputable. Now, you can find animal organizational structures that vary from that, what would you call it, fundamental pattern. But the existence of variance isn't proof against the existence of a fundamental pattern. Like, I don't know how you can sit there and be skeptical about this. If you know the literature on hierarchical structure, you understand that across the entire animal kingdom, animals tend to organize themselves into hierarchies.
But
and, that the neurochemistry
but very
of the
different types of hierarchies, right?
So well, there's a pattern. That's why we know they're hierarchies.
Right. Yeah, but like you say, the pattern as if that's, you know, the
hierarchy is the pattern.
Right. Okay, and that's fine. So chimps have one very obvious social structure, and bonobos have another.
It's not
one.
as different as people have made it out to be. No. The bonobos are a lot more violent than the
and they're not hippie monkeys, right?
Observers of the bonobos have admitted.
Okay, but nonetheless, you say that as if those little details don't matter, as if there can't be such a thing as a hierarchy that is much worse than another hierarchy. That's my problem with it.
I'm not saying that at all. There's clearly hierarchies that are worse than other hierarchies. Right. Baboons have terrible hierarchies, for example. And tyrannical hierarchies aren't my cup of tea. Right. That isn't the point I was making. No. The point I was making was that hierarchies can't be blamed on capitalism or the West. They're built into our biology. The neurochemistry is so old that we share it with crustaceans, so that's 1/3 of a billion years, which is the proof that hierarchies aren't a recent construct. If proof like that needs to be provided, and that the best way for people to adopt a strategy that will move them up the hierarchy, which is a desirable thing in most regards, is to face the suffering of the world forthrightly. That's what that chapter is about. And the people who've been criticizing it read it as if it's a defense of the Western patriarchy. It's like, there's no defense of the Western patriarchy.
No, I don't think that's true. I think the way that people criticize it is and I think this happens a lot with evolutionary psychology, is which is not quite what the lobsters are, but is where other stuff in the book is. Other things you said, for example, like women wear rouge because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Right? Well, for a start...
Why do you think women wear rouge?
I have absolutely no idea. But
right,
I will tell you,
that's really not a very good answer.
Well, yeah, you said before there were lots of things you don't know the answer to. But I'll tell you one thing.
I'm not criticizing your perspective on this. You're criticizing mine, so I'm presuming you have an alternative idea. Why do you think women wear makeup? Why do you
I think there are an enormous number. But let's go back to why women wear rouge, because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Okay, first of all, not all ripe fruit is red. Why would you
want
to...
we evolved colour vision to detect ripe fruit. Eh?
Do you want to eat women? No. I think unless men are having sex with ripe fruit...
You might want to taste them.
That's not really where... And where is the evidence that women who are redder in the cheeks have more offspring?
What do you think happens during a sexual flush?
But that's the key point, isn't it? Is that you would expect, actually, if this is a sexual selection, that women who are redder would have more children. We would get progressively redder over time.
One of the hallmarks of youthful skin is the proclivity for it to flush red. And yes, youthful women have more children. It's a primary sign of fertility.
I think you're using...
Wait a second here. What do you think women wear makeup for? Come on, if you're going to go after me on this,
okay.
Let's women. People say, well, women wear makeup to feel better about themselves. It's not a very deep analysis. Why makeup? Why facial makeup?
I'll tell you why I wear makeup, which is to stop the comments that I would get if I didn't wear makeup. And my gender, I always say my gender is low maintenance, right? I don't feel particularly like a woman inside. I don't really know what that would mean. But what I try and do is try and look, you know, in the same way that you get black women who talk about the problem with natural hair, is it's seen as unprofessional, right? And as a woman, if you don't wear makeup, that is seen as a political choice. That is seen as something that, you know, you are...
So you wear makeup to protect yourself from what? From tyrannical men?
No, but tyrannical women as well, I would say. I think women very harshly judge each other's appearance, and there are very good reasons for that.
It's probably because they've learned that from oppressive men.
No, I don't think so.
Why do you think it is, then?
I think that women are encouraged to be seen as being in competition with each other.
Encouraged? You don't think that there's anything about that that's natural, eh?
Well, I would be reluctant to get into that, because I think you could talk about intrasexual competition. I think that's a very big deal among the social sciences and evolutionary science. It's not my particular competence. But yeah, my conception of the patriarchy is not that men are beastly to women. It is that there is a structure in which women participate too that overall privileges and benefits men in order to control female reproduction. And I think those are two very different things.
Of course you think that. Well, because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that, because then you only have to think one thing. You have a one-thing answer for everything. You could let me... It's part of the patriarchal institution.
Okay, let's talk about free speech to finish on. You write in your book about Nietzsche, who became the Nazis' favourite intellectual. And you also talk about a professor...
Only through his sister's mistranslations of his work.
Right. But you talk a little bit as well about another professor whose ideas you thought led inevitably to kind of Maoism, and you said, I don't know how he can't be more worried about where his ideas lead. Do you worry about where where your work might be taken and used by other people? I saw you posing with...
I worry about that all the time.
With a Pepe flag.
Oh, I can't believe you brought that up.
Right, but I just think it's...
Seriously, I can't believe you brought that up. You should go online.
Yeah. I do. Believe me, I do.
There's a video called, I think it's called, "Is Jordan Peterson a Darling of the Alt-Right?" Have you watched the video of the person who put up that Pepe flag with me? He's online. But go watch it.
I have seen. You wouldn't, I would say.
And why are you concerned about Pepe, anyways? Jesus, he disappeared like 3 years ago.
It is,
and most of that was trolling by young guys who were trying to drag the media into idiot accusations, like the idea that this was a white supremacist gesture, which I was asked about on CBC. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was Fortran trolls playing the media for fools, which worked. And much of the Pepe thing was that as well.
Okay, but the problem with people ironically pretending to be Nazis on the internet...
They weren't pretending to be Nazis.
But no, this is a separate phenomenon, and 4chan definitely do ironically pretend to be all of the worst things they can possibly be, is that some people take that very seriously. There was a case in America recently of a guy who stabbed his father because he had thought that his father was a Democrat. He was writing stuff for a conservative website. He'd got very into the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
He was probably paranoid.
Right, so there are people who take this stuff very, very seriously, and they latch onto it.
What's your point?
I'm saying that, how much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say, I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay.
Find some evidence. I'm extraordinarily sick and tired of this particular accusation / line of questioning. I'm no fan of the identitarian right. the ethno-nationalists, the alt-right. First of all, what do you mean by alt-right exactly? Do you mean ethno-nationalists? Do you mean white supremacists?
No, I mean people who are on the right but have got their power base outside the traditional media. They see themselves as an alternative. So I see them coming
That's a pretty loose definition of the alt-right.
Rush Limbaugh kind of talk radio, right? People who see themselves in opposition to an establishment.
Rush Limbaugh is not the alt-right. He's been around for 30 years.
Right, so he's the progenitor of what I see now. Breitbart and things like that are the new media version of that very old media.
Well, let's define what constitutes alt-right first. For me, they're ethno-nationalists. They tend to be white supremacists. And generally, when people tar me with an alt-right epithet, the reason they're doing that is to associate me with those people. They don't like me. And the reason for that is that I've made it very clear, not only in my videos, but on Twitter, that I don't like them. I don't like their anti-Semitism. I don't like their use of identity politics. I don't agree with their aims. I think that their notion is something like, well, if everybody's going to play identity politics, we're going to play it too, and we're going to win. And I can certainly understand that motivation, but I think it's a bad game all around. And I think the only reason that I was ever associated in any sense whatsoever with anything to do with the alt-right was because it was extremely convenient of the radical leftists, who I fundamentally detest, to paint me as a representative of that viewpoint.
Right.
Other than that, zero. Now,
that's okay, but that's not what I did. You say so. At no point did I say you were.
Well, you brought up the whole peppy thing.
But I did bring that up. But there was a reason I did that, which is that Nietzsche himself said I'm an anti-Semite, right? And yet his ideology and his philosophy ended up being used by the Nazis. So my question to you is, how much responsibility do you feel about the way in which your work is used?
It isn't even what I feel. It's not how much responsibility I feel. It's how much responsibility I take.
Right.
Right. And I take as much responsibility as I possibly can. Right. Which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Right. I'm going around the world. I'm talking in different cities. I'm talking to people as much as I can. I'm putting out content that I think is useful for people online. And I'm clarifying what I think. I have 300 videos on YouTube. Virtually, for all intents and purposes, every single word I've said to students in a professional capacity since 1992. And despite the fact that I have innumerable, highly motivated enemies, they haven't been able to find one thing I've said in 30 years that, what would you say, justifies any of those accusations, or any other accusations for that matter. So it's quite the phenomena. I mean, I understand it to some degree, you know, because...
So, sorry, about the Pepe flag, you can help me explain this. Why did you pose with it? What were your reasons for doing it? Did people just come up and bring it to you and
Yeah, I was like posing with... I've probably been photographed with, I don't know, 5,000 people in the last 2 years. And, you know, it's one after the other, often in groups of 100, 150 or 200 people. And it's like 15 seconds.
Right.
And they brought this flag. One of them had spoken at the event. They were doing it ironically. They unfurled the flag, and we took a picture, and that was that.
Would you have posed ironically with a hammer and sickle flag?
I don't know under the circumstances what I would have done. I have all sorts of Soviet art in my house.
Right. Because this is, I think, anybody could get caught out, and social embarrassment is a huge factor, and you don't want to kind of tell people who've been very nice to you that actually you don't want to do the thing. I just wonder if that's something that you regret now, that you wouldn't do it again if you had the opportunity.
Well, I don't think it did me any good. I don't think I'll betray my former self. We'll just leave it where it is. I made the decision that I made under the circumstances and took what was there into consideration. I think that the Pepe formulators did a wonderful job of trolling the standard media. I don't think that they were what everyone presumed them to be.
I think they did a wonderful job of trolling you as well, in a sense, right? Recruiting you and your image and your appeal to people to their kind of cause, which is ironic.
I don't really think so.
But is not actually. Underneath it all, I don't find it very ironic, actually.
What don't you find ironic?
That a lot of the kind of 4chan culture, which is saying, I'm just going to say the worst possible thing that I can say just to prove that I can say it because free speech is still alive, I think that in itself is quite poisonous to the discourse. I think I try and conduct myself online in a relatively civilized manner. I do not always succeed, but I do not think just going into a room and screaming epithets is something that I need to do on a daily basis to prove that free speech isn't dead, right?
I think we could probably agree that that's a reasonable a
rare note of consensus. But I have to come back to the free speech idea, because I think that whole idea of the intellectual dark web, and this came up a couple of times at your event on Thursday, is predicated on the idea that you have been marginalised for your opinions or oppressed for your opinions.
It's not predicated on my claim of that.
Right. It's predicated on...
Well, I don't know. I'm not claiming I've been marginalised. I would never use that word, first of all. That's for sure.
So, but the idea of a dark...
I don't feel oppressed.
Good. I'm pleased to hear it. But I do think that the way that you got the cheers from that crowd was very much about, there was an idea of taboo breaking, right? That oh, this is a microaggression, but I'm going to say it anyway, that, you know, hard work is the way to succeed. And I thought that was fascinating, because to me you don't look like somebody who has particularly suffered an outrageous amount for your opinions. People have certainly disagreed. They've been rude. They've in some cases.
The only reason I haven't suffered an outrageous amount for my opinions is because I've handled the consequence of their utterance exceptionally well. My job was at risk. My career was at risk. My family stability was at risk. So I wouldn't push that one too far.
In what way was your job at risk?
Jesus. Last year, 200 of my fellow faculty members signed a petition to get me fired. That was only one of a dozen things that happened. The university wrote me 2 letters, 2 cease and desist letters from their HR departments with their legal staff. 3 of those and you're done. They just fired Rick Maida in Canada at Acadia University for talking about many of the same things that I've talked about. So the fact that I've come through this relatively unscathed has very little to do with the vitriol of the attacks. There was plenty of motivation to take me out. It just didn't work.
Right. And I think the fact that it didn't work, to me, makes me ultimately optimistic about where we are, because I've...
Why?
Because I went on, I did a panel a while ago with Zarganara, a Burmese comedian, who was imprisoned for making a joke, right? And we are not yet at that stage. I think, undoubtedly, I get...
We're not. We're damn close.
Really?
How about the guy with the pug in the UK?
Count Dankula.
That's the one.
Right, but he did actually, I mean... That
was a joke. You might not have liked it. I didn't say it was a good joke. I didn't say it was an appropriate joke. I didn't say any of that. I didn't say it was a well thought through joke. But it was a joke.
Yeah, I just fundamentally don't believe that it was a joke. I believe that it was camouflaged as a joke, and that's what it kind of comes across.
Right.
And
Well, that's exactly what you would believe if you were inclined to persecute comedians.
No, I'm not inclined to persecute someone.
Well, you're inclined to persecute him.
I don't think he's a comedian, and I don't think... I would have to go and look at the circumstances of that case, but I think...
He didn't like his girlfriend's pug and thought he would teach it to do something reprehensible as a joke.
Right, but I see you getting involved, say, tweeting Douglas Murray's article about Tommy Robinson, and I think you see that as a free speech issue, and that's not how I see Tommy Robinson's case at all. I see that as contempt of court, someone who endangered a grooming trial. How do you see that case?
I see it as very fortunate that Tommy Robinson didn't die in prison.
I think I would say that about a lot of people in prison. I think it's very hard to be in prison if you are a sex offender, for example. I think our British prisons are less inhumane than American prisons, but they are still brutal places to be. However, I do think that was an appropriate punishment for somebody who tried to collapse a grooming trial.
Well,
but are you a prison abolitionist?
No.
Oh, right, okay. So you do believe that some people, there are offences for which people need to go to prison?
Why would you ask me a question like that?
Well,
do I look like someone who isn't interested in meting out appropriate punishment?
No, but I just thought maybe I've made an assumption about you. And I didn't want to make an assumption about you. And finally, how would you like to be remembered?
As someone honest.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you very much.